This is not just the story of 10 rules carved into stone. It is the story of a people who were rescued from slavery, only to discover that freedom without truth becomes another kind of bondage. It is the story of a God who does not merely break chains, but rebuilds a broken people from the inside out. It is the story of a mountain that became a courtroom, a sanctuary, and a wedding altar all at once. It is the story of fire, thunder, boundaries, and a voice that did not come to entertain, but to form. Because long before Israel learned how to live as a nation, they had to learn who was actually leading them. And long before God wrote commandments on stone, He was writing dependence into their hearts in the wilderness. Let us go back in time, not back to Egypt, back to the days just after the sea closed behind them, when victory still felt warm and new. The songs of deliverance still echoed in their tents, but the desert had already begun to edit their memory. Hunger came, thirst came, fear came, and each time Israel discovered something uncomfortable. Pain can make a freed person think like a slave again. Yet God kept leading them anyway, not because they were steady, but because He was. In the 3rd month after leaving Egypt, they arrived at the wilderness of Sinai, and the horizon changed. A mountain rose like a dark spine against the sky, massive and unmoving, as if creation itself had been waiting for this appointment. They set their camp in front of it, and something in the air felt different, heavier, like the silence before a storm. Moses went up the mountain, and the Lord called to him, reminding him what Israel had already seen with their own eyes. He reminded them that He had struck Egypt, carried them, and brought them to Himself, not just away from Pharaoh, but toward God. Then the offer came like a covenant spoken aloud. If they would obey and keep His covenant, they would be His treasured possession among all peoples. They would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, not because they were strong, but because they would belong to Him. The people answered quickly, "We will do it," because promises are easiest when the cost is still invisible. So God commanded preparation. Consecrate the people, wash their garments, set limits around the mountain, because holiness is not casual and glory is not safe. And then came the 3rd day. Morning did not arrive gently. Thunder broke over Sinai, lightning tore through the sky, and a thick cloud settled on the mountain like a veil. A trumpet blast sounded, not from human lungs, but like the sky itself was breathing warning. The entire camp trembled, because this was not the fear of an army you can see. This was the fear of a God you cannot control. Moses brought the people out to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain, small as dust, beneath a world that was shaking. Sinai smoked because the Lord had descended in fire, and the smoke rose like the smoke of a furnace. The mountain quaked violently, and the trumpet grew louder and louder, as if the moment itself was intensifying. Moses spoke, and God answered him, and Israel realized that their rescue was never meant to end at escape. It was meant to lead to a voice, and that voice was about to give them the only kind of freedom that lasts, a freedom with a moral center. The mountain was still burning when the voice began. Not a suggestion, not a private whisper. A declaration spoken over an entire nation, like law written into the air before it was ever written into stone. And the first words were not a command. They were an identity. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Because before God tells people what to do, He tells them who He is. And before He gives them responsibility, He reminds them of rescue. Israel did not climb Sinai to earn a relationship. They stood there because they already had one. And yet, standing at the foot of that fire, they were about to learn something they had never learned in Egypt. A slave can obey out of fear, but a son must learn to obey out of love and allegiance. So the first command struck the root of every other sin. You shall have no other gods before me. Not because other gods were strong, but because the human heart is always searching for a throne to place something on. In Egypt, gods were everywhere. Images on walls, statues in temples, symbols in the marketplace, religion that you could see, touch, and control. And even after the Red Sea, Israel still carried Egypt in their imagination. They still wanted something visible to hold. They still wanted power they could manage. That is why the second command came like a guardrail around the first. You shall not make for yourself an image. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Because idolatry is not just kneeling to a statue. It is shrinking the infinite God down to a size your fear can control. It is taking mystery and turning it into management. It is demanding a God who fits inside your expectations. And Sinai was exposing the truth. The God of Israel does not fit in your hands. He holds you in His. Then the voice moved from what Israel worships to how Israel speaks. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Because a name is not only a label. A name is reputation. A name is character. A name is weight. And Israel had seen the weight of God's name in plagues, in fire, in water, in bread, in mercy. So to treat that name like empty sound was to treat God like an object. It was to use holiness as a tool for your own agenda. And the wilderness was already showing them how quickly humans learn to do that. We will speak faith when it feels safe. We will invoke God when it helps us. We will praise Him when the sea opens, and accuse Him when the water runs dry. Then the voice did something unexpected. It commanded rest. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. In Egypt, their bodies were tools. In Egypt, their value was production. In Egypt, tomorrow was controlled by masters, so you hoarded, you hurried, you worked until you broke. But the God of Israel was teaching a different rhythm. A rhythm where one day in 7 was a declaration. You are not slaves anymore. A rhythm where stopping was not laziness, but trust. A rhythm where rest became worship because it said, God will hold us even when our hands are open. And there at Sinai, Israel began to realize the commandments were not a ladder to climb. They were a map for people who had already been carried. They were boundaries, not because God wanted less joy, but because God wanted freedom to survive the wilderness. And still, the people trembled. Because the voice was not only giving laws, it was confronting their deepest addiction. The addiction to control. The addiction to visible gods. The addiction to endless striving. And the God who saved them was now demanding something more intimate than escape. He was demanding exclusive love. After the commands that aimed upward, God spoke commands that aimed outward. Because worship is never only about what happens in a sanctuary. Worship always leaks into how a person treats the people closest to them. And the first command in this second half was not about armies or temples. It was about a house. Honor your father and your mother, because a nation cannot survive if it forgets how to honor the roots that carried it. Egypt trained them to honor power. Sinai was training them to honor covenant, and then the voice cut straight through the excuses people hide behind. You shall not murder. Not because God needed to be reminded that life is valuable, but because humans forget that the image of God can be standing right in front of them, breathing, fragile, unprotected. Slavery had trained Israel to see bodies as tools. Sinai was teaching them to see lives as sacred. Then, the command turned toward the private places where betrayal often begins. You shall not commit adultery. Because covenant is not only something you talk about on holy days. Covenant is what you protect when no one is watching. And next came the command that exposes the ancient fear of scarcity. You shall not steal. Because stealing is not only taking property. Stealing is declaring, God will not provide, so I must take. It is grabbing control with your hands because trust feels too slow. Then the voice struck the tongue, the weapon people carry everywhere. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Because lies do not only distort facts, lies destroy communities. Lies turn neighbors into threats and disagreements into wars. And finally, the command went deeper than action. It went into desire. You shall not covet. Because God was not only building a nation that behaves, He was building a nation that is healed at the level of the heart. Coveting is the silent rebellion that says, what God gave me is not enough. It is resentment dressed as longing. It is envy pretending to be need. And at Sinai, the Lord exposed the truth that the wilderness had been revealing for weeks. A person can leave Egypt and still carry Egypt inside them. They can stop making bricks and still be enslaved to appetite. They can be free in geography and still chained in desire. That is why the commandments were not random. They were a complete reordering of a people who had been shaped by trauma, oppression, and survival. But while God was speaking, the people were coming undone. They saw the thunder and lightning. They heard the trumpet. They watched the mountains smoking. And they trembled and stood at a distance, because holiness feels like danger when your conscience is awake. They said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, or we will die." So Moses became what they asked for. He stood between fire and flesh. He stepped closer into the darkness where God was, while the people stepped farther back into what felt safe. And that is where the tension of Sinai sharpened. Israel wanted the benefits of God without the nearness of God. Israel wanted rescue, but they feared relationship. Yet God was still moving toward them, because the voice that gave the law was not trying to crush them. It was trying to make them a people who could live. And soon, God would show them that covenant is not only spoken. Covenant is sealed. Covenant is witnessed. Covenant costs something. And at the foot of Sinai, Israel was about to answer the question that every rescued heart eventually faces. Will they trust God only when He saves them? Or will they trust Him enough to obey Him? The voice had spoken. Now the covenant had to be answered. Because words at Sinai were not meant to be admired. They were meant to be agreed to. Moses came down and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. And the people answered with one voice, "All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do." They said it together. They said it confidently. They said it like a nation that believed agreement was the same thing as transformation. So Moses did something that turned revelation into record. He wrote down all the words of the Lord, because memory is part of obedience. And the next morning, before the heat rose, Moses built an altar at the foot of the mountain. Not on the mountain, at the foot, because the covenant was not made by people climbing up to God. It was made by God, coming down to them. Beside the altar, Moses set up 12 stone pillars, one for each tribe, a silent declaration that this was not a private spiritual moment. This was national. This was communal. This was binding. Then the sacrifices began. Animals were brought forward. Fire rose. Smoke curled into the desert air. And blood filled the bowls, dark and heavy, because covenant is never sealed with sentiment. Covenant is sealed with life. Moses took half of the blood and threw it against the altar, a sign that God was not being recruited into Israel's plans. Israel was being bound to God's will. Then Moses took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And again they answered, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." The second vow sounded even stronger than the first, because repeating a promise can feel like proof. But God was not asking for louder words. He was asking for a surrendered heart. And then came the moment that made Sinai unforgettable. Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, not to humiliate them, to mark them, to say, "You belong to this covenant now." And Moses declared, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." In other words, the law was not floating above them like abstract ideals. It was binding them like a holy contract. It was marrying them into a relationship where God would be their God and they would be His people. Then something happened that feels almost impossible to imagine. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement of sapphire, as bright blue as the sky, and God did not raise His hand against them. They saw God, and they ate and drank. A covenant meal, a sign of peace, a table in the presence of holiness. Because God was not only giving commands, He was offering communion. He was showing Israel that obedience is not the opposite of relationship. Obedience is what protects relationship from becoming imagination. But the story of Sinai was never only about a ceremony, it was about what would happen after the ceremony. Because it is one thing to say, "We will obey," at the foot of a burning mountain. It is another thing to obey when the mountain becomes quiet, when the leader disappears into cloud, when days pass, when silence stretches, when waiting feels like abandonment. And that is where the next battle would begin. Not a battle with swords, a battle with impatience, a battle with control, a battle with the craving for something visible. The covenant had been sealed at the foot of the mountain, but the real test of covenant is never the ceremony. The real test is what you do when the moment fades, when the fire is still on the summit, but the voice is no longer speaking, when you are left with nothing to do but wait. Then the Lord called Moses back up. "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone." Moses rose and went with Joshua part of the way. He told the leaders to wait, and he left Aaron and Hur with them to handle disputes. And then Moses climbed into the cloud. The cloud covered Sinai. The glory of the Lord settled on the mountain, and to Israel below, it looked like a consuming fire on the summit. For 6 days the cloud remained. On the 7th day, God called Moses from within it. And Moses entered the cloud and stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days is long enough for fear to start narrating, long enough for imagination to turn silence into suspicion, long enough for a rescued people to begin acting like a terrified crowd again. Because the human heart does not only fear suffering, it fears uncertainty. It fears the space between promise and proof. Down in the camp, time stretched. The days warmed and cooled. The manna kept appearing. The pillar still stood. But Moses was gone. And the absence of the mediator began to feel like the absence of God. That is how panic works. It erases evidence. It shrinks memory. It turns yesterday's miracles into today's doubt. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. And they said words that should have been impossible to speak at Sinai. "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Listen to the tragedy in that sentence. Moses brought us up, not the Lord who split the sea, not the Lord who rained bread, not the Lord who thundered from the mountain. Waiting had already stolen the glory from God and handed it to a man. And when that man disappeared, the crowd demanded a replacement they could control. A God small enough to carry, a God predictable enough to manage, a God silent enough to never confront them. Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings and bring them to me." Gold that had come out of Egypt as plunder of deliverance, gold that could have marked a new beginning, gold that now became raw material for an old slavery. They handed it over, and Aaron took what they gave him and fashioned it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf. A calf, a familiar symbol from a familiar world. Because when fear rises, people do not usually invent new sins. They return to the ones they learned in captivity. Then the crowd spoke the most terrifying rewrite of the Exodus story. "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." They took the credit of the living God and assigned it to a thing that cannot breathe. They traded thunder for metal. They traded covenant for control. They traded an invisible presence for a visible substitute. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf. He announced a festival, and the next day the people rose early, offered sacrifices, sat down to eat and drink, and then got up to indulge in revelry. The mountain still burned above them, but below, the camp was burning with a different fire. Not holy fire. The fire of impatience. The fire of self-made religion. The fire of a heart that would rather have something it can see than someone it must trust. And while Israel danced around what they made, God spoke again in the cloud. "Go down at once, for your people have corrupted themselves." The covenant had been signed in blood, and now it was being shattered in gold. Up in the cloud, God did not speak like a distant judge. He spoke like a covenant Lord who had been betrayed. "Go down," he said, because what was happening below was not a small mistake. It was a collapse of allegiance. "They have quickly turned aside from the way I commanded them," the Lord said. "They have made themselves an idol and said, 'This is your God, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.'" And then came a phrase that exposes the true nature of Israel's problem. "I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people." Stiff-necked, like an animal that refuses the yoke, like a heart that refuses to turn, even when mercy is pulling on it. Then God spoke judgment in words that sounded final. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. And I will make you into a great nation." It was an offer that would have tempted many leaders. A fresh start. A new people with Moses at the center. A story where Moses could become the replacement for Israel's failure. But Moses was not hungry for personal legacy. He was hungry for God's name to be honored. So Moses did the one thing that proves covenant leadership is not celebrity. He interceded. Moses pleaded with the Lord. He appealed to God's rescue, to God's reputation, to God's promises. He asked why God's wrath should burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand. He asked why the Egyptians should be able to claim God brought Israel out only to destroy them. And he asked God to remember the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Moses was doing what a mediator does. He was standing between deserved judgment and undeserved mercy. He was refusing to let Israel's failure have the last word. And then the text says something that makes Sinai feel even more mysterious. So the Lord relented from the calamity he had threatened to bring on his people. Not because sin was small, but because intercession mattered. Because covenant mercy was real. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain. In his hands, he carried the 2 tablets of the testimony. Tablets written on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. In other words, Moses was carrying something that no human could manufacture. He was carrying a gift, a physical sign that the covenant was not imagined. It was authored. As Moses and Joshua approached, Joshua heard the sound coming from the camp. Joshua thought it sounded like war, but Moses knew better. "It is not the sound of victory," he said. "It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear." And then they came close enough to see it. The calf, the dancing, the celebration in the shadow of the smoking mountain. And Moses' anger burned, not the anger of wounded pride, the anger of covenant grief, the anger of a man who had just been given holy words, only to find those words already rejected. So Moses threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. The breaking was not random. It was a sign. The covenant had been broken, not by God's weakness, but by Israel's betrayal. Then Moses took the calf they had made. He burned it in the fire. He ground it to powder. He scattered it on the water and made the Israelites drink it. Because a false god always ends the same way. It cannot save you. It cannot lead you. And in the end, it turns to dust and bitterness in your mouth. When the dust settled, Moses turned to Aaron, not with a whisper, with the kind of question that strips excuses down to the bone. "What did these people do to you, that you led them into such great sin?" It was not only a question about leadership, it was a question about responsibility. Because in the wilderness, blame spreads faster than fire. Aaron answered the way weak leaders often answer. "Do not be angry, my Lord," he said. "You know how prone these people are to evil." And then he retold the story as if he had been dragged into it. They demanded gods. They panicked about Moses. He merely asked for gold. He merely threw it into the fire. And then he said the line that sounds almost unbelievable. And out came this calf. As if sin is an accident. As if idolatry just appears. As if rebellion is something that happens to you, not something you choose. But Moses could see the truth in the camp. The people were running wild. Aaron had let them run wild. and their worship had become a public disgrace. So Moses did something that drew a line through the middle of the nation. He stood at the entrance to the camp and shouted, "Whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me!" And all the Levites rallied to him. In that moment, Israel learned a hard reality. Neutrality is not an option when God has spoken. You can't keep one hand on covenant and one hand on the calf. Moses gave them the command, and the cost of sin became visible. The Levites went through the camp, and about 3,000 men fell that day. It was judgment. It was grief. It was a warning written into Israel's memory that idolatry is never harmless. Because the golden calf was not a private coping mechanism, it was a rebellion that could have reshaped the entire nation into Egypt again. And then Moses spoke to the Levites about consecration, about being set apart, because holiness always requires separation from what destroys. But even after judgment, Moses knew the story was not finished, because cutting down the idol does not automatically heal the heart that made it. So the next day, Moses stood before the people and told them the truth. "You have committed a great sin." And then he did something that reveals the weight of true mediation. He went back up to the Lord, not to defend himself, not to demand his own safety, but to plead for the very people who had nearly killed him with their impatience. Moses returned to the Lord and confessed, "Alas, this people have sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold." He did not soften it. He did not rename it. He did not call it a misunderstanding. He called it what it was. And then Moses asked for mercy with words that sound like someone offering his own life. "But now, if you will forgive their sin, and if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." That is the moment the story widens beyond Israel's failure, because Moses is not just angry lawgiver. Moses is intercessor. Moses is willing to be erased if it means the people can live. And underneath that plea is the beating heart of Sinai. The law reveals what God is like, but it also reveals what we are like. It shows how quickly humans trade the invisible God for visible substitutes. It shows how quickly we excuse what we chose. It shows how desperately we need mercy that is stronger than our collapse. And the next words from God would show Israel something else. That forgiveness is not the same thing as pretending nothing happened. That mercy does not erase holiness, and that the journey to the promised land would now carry the weight of this moment. Moses offered himself, but God answered with a justice that could not be negotiated away. "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." In other words, Moses could not erase the moral weight of rebellion by sheer passion. A mediator can plead. A mediator can stand in the gap. But holiness still names sin as sin. Then God gave Moses a hard instruction that sounded like mercy and judgment at the same time. "Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of. My angel will go before you. But when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin." And the chapter ends with a wound that proves the golden calf was not a harmless mistake. The Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. Sin had a cost. The camp felt it. The families felt it. Israel learned that idolatry is never just spiritual. It spills into bodies. It spills into communities. It spills into futures. Then the Lord spoke again, and this time, the words sounded like exile inside the promise. "Leave this place and go up to the land flowing with milk and honey." But then came the sentence that hit like a funeral bell. I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. Do you hear it? A promised land without God's presence. A destination without the one who makes the destination worth reaching. A blessing without the blesser. For a people who had just built an idol to feel safe, this was the most terrifying possibility imaginable, because they were never truly hungry for geography. They were hungry for nearness, even if they didn't know how to admit it yet. When the people heard these distressing words, they mourned. No dancing now, no festival now, no pretending now. They took off their ornaments, the same kind of ornaments that had fed the calf, as if they were saying, "We will not decorate our sin anymore." As if they were saying, "We finally understand what we risked losing." Because in the wilderness, you can survive without gold. You cannot survive without God. And this is where Moses' leadership becomes even more costly. He had already confronted the camp. He had already shattered the tablets. He had already pleaded for mercy. Now he had to plead for presence. Moses spoke to the Lord with the boldness of a man who knew that covenant is not a contract. It is relationship. He said, "You have been telling me, 'Lead these people,' but you have not let me know whom you will send with me." He asked God to teach him God's ways so that he could know God and continue to find favor. And then Moses said, the line that reveals the true goal of Exodus: "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. Not if you don't give us the land. Not if you don't defeat our enemies. But if you don't go with us." Because without God's presence, Israel would just be a wandering crowd, with a history of miracles and a future of idols. Moses pressed further because he understood what makes God's people distinct. "How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And in that moment, the commandments at Sinai stopped sounding like distant laws and started sounding like the boundary lines of intimacy. Because the point was never stone tablets alone. The point was a people who could live near a holy God without being consumed. And that is where the story prepares to step into its deepest moment. Moses will ask to see glory. God will reveal his name. And after the collapse of the golden calf, the covenant will be renewed, not with naive confidence, but with mercy and holy fear. After the calf, the center of the camp could no longer pretend to be clean. So Moses moved the meeting place. He took a tent and pitched it outside the camp some distance away, and he called it the Tent of Meeting. Anyone who wanted to inquire of the Lord had to walk out to it, because sin does not only break rules, sin breaks proximity. And for Israel, that distance was a visible sermon. Every time Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrances of their tents, watching him until he entered. And when Moses entered, the pillar of cloud came down and stayed at the entrance while the Lord spoke with Moses. When the people saw the pillar of cloud, they stood and worshipped, each at the entrance to their tent. They were learning again what they had forgotten. God was not a statue you can place in the middle of your camp. God is a presence you must approach with humility. And then Scripture says something astonishing about Moses. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend, not because Moses was perfect, But because Moses kept showing up, he kept walking into the place of meeting. He kept bringing the people's crisis into God's presence instead of running from it. And Joshua, his young aide, did not leave the tent. As if the next generation was being trained in the atmosphere Israel almost traded away. Then Moses prayed with a boldness that only desperation can produce. He asked God to teach him God's ways. He asked for favor, not as entitlement, but as mercy. And Moses insisted that the only true proof of God's approval was God's presence. But Moses was not done asking. Because the collapse at Sinai had exposed a deeper hunger. Israel needed more than a list of commands. They needed to know the heart behind the commands. So Moses asked the question that every wounded leader eventually asks. Now show me your glory. He did not ask for a strategy. He did not ask for a faster route to the land. He asked to see what kind of God could stay with people like this. And God answered with both gift and boundary. I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But then God drew the line no human can cross. You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. So the Lord made a way for Moses to be near without being consumed. There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. This was not God teasing Moses. This was God protecting him. Because holiness is not safe, but it is good. And Moses was about to learn that God's glory is not mainly a spectacle. God's glory is God's character. That is why the next moment becomes the heartbeat of Scripture. When the Lord passed in front of Moses, he proclaimed his own name. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. In other words, the commandments were not given by a cold power. They were given by a merciful king who is committed to truth, a God who forgives, yet does not pretend evil is harmless, a God who holds justice and mercy together without dropping either. And suddenly, the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai come into focus. They were never meant to be Israel's ladder into God's presence. They were meant to be Israel's guardrails for living inside God's presence. Because the greatest miracle of Exodus is not only that God split a sea, it is that God chose to dwell with a people who keep trying to run back to Egypt. Sinai did not end with shattered tablets. It ended with a second chance that cost something. Because grace does not pretend the first covenant moment never happened. Grace rebuilds after it breaks. The Lord said to Moses, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning," he said. "Come up on Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain." And no one was to come with him, no crowds, no witnesses, not even flocks grazing near the mountain. Because the second ascent was not a spectacle. It was surgical. It was sacred. It was God restoring what human rebellion had shattered. So Moses rose early. He carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands, and he climbed again into the place where thunder once ruled the air. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him. And the Lord proclaimed his name, the same name Moses had just heard. the same character Israel desperately needed to understand, because the Ten Commandments were never detached from God's heart. They were the shape of life near a God who is compassionate and holy. Then God spoke covenant words again. He told Moses to write these words, "For in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." Moses remained there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He ate no bread and drank no water. And the words of the covenant were written on the tablets again, not because God's standard had softened, but because God's mercy was stronger than Israel's collapse. And then Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets in his hands. He did not know that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. But Aaron and all the Israelites saw it, and they were afraid to come near him. That fear is telling. They had begged Moses to stand between them and God's voice. Now they saw what nearness to God does to a human life. It leaves an imprint, not an imprint of ego, an imprint of glory. Moses called to them anyway. He spoke the commands the Lord had given him, and when he finished speaking, he put a veil over his face. He would remove it when he went in to speak with the Lord. He would cover it when he came out to speak with the people. Because Israel was still learning what it means to live near holiness without dying of fear. And that is how the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai should be remembered. Not as 10 random rules to prove who is good enough, but as covenant boundaries for a rescued people learning to stay close to the God who saved them. Because the commandments do not begin with "try harder," they begin with "I brought you out." And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether God can break chains. The question is whether a freed heart will stop building calves when waiting feels unbearable. Whether a rescued people will trade the invisible presence for visible substitutes. Whether obedience will become relationship instead of mere religion. So here is the mirror. Where has impatience been shaping your theology? Where has fear been demanding something you can control? Where have you been calling a calf security while God is offering presence? Because the invitation of Sinai still stands, not only to leave Egypt, but to live with God on the other side of deliverance, and when failure happens, not to run to idols, but to return to the God whose name is mercy and faithfulness.